World of Warcraft. Tides of Darkness by Aaron Rosenberg. Chapter 7. Tell us everything. Khadgar nodded, not bothering to look around. It would be pointless. He had been summoned before by the ruling council of Kirin Tor, and those leaders were only visible when they wished to be. He had stood in the council chamber once before upon being told he would be apprenticed to Medivh. Then he had been awed by the room, which seemed somehow hang in the air, only the floor faintly visible as the world around darkened, lightened, and stormed far more rapidly than ever happened in nature. The council members themselves had awed him just as much, appearing only as cloaked, hooded figures, their forms and faces and very genders obscured by both cloth and magic. That was both dramatic and practical, since the wizard community leaders were chosen in secret to avoid any danger of bribery, blackmail, and other pressure. The council members knew each other's identities, but no one else did. The disguises ensured that, but they also gave the council an air of mystery, and many of its members delighted in this confusion, making sure no one entered or exited the chamber without being bewildered as to where they had been and whom they had seen, and often even what they had said and heard. It had clearly worked on Khadgar back then, and he left the chamber with his head awhirl, amazed at the power his superiors wielded, and unable to recount exactly what had happened during his audience. Much had changed since then, however. Though it had only been a few short years, Khadgar had grown considerably in both knowledge and power. His appearance had changed as well, and he amused himself by thinking that for once some of the council members would be as bewildered by their visitor as he was by them. After all, he had left a young man and returned an old one. Older than many of them, though, he had lived far less. Regardless, Khadgar found he was unwilling to play games. He was tired. He had teleported himself to Dauron, and while his magic was strong enough to handle the task, it was still a daunting distance. Plus, he had been up late discussing matters with Lothar, planning for the first official strategy session next week. Khadgar appreciated his former master's interest in recounting events, and felt they needed to know what had occurred in Azeroth. But he felt he could do without the posturing and performances and shadow plays. That is why, when he finally did lift his head, he looked straight at the cloaked figure to his left. "I'll be happy to recount these events, Prince Kael'thas," he said politely. "But I would find it far easier, telling far easier, were I able to see my audience properly." He heard a gasp off to the side, but the cloaked figure he had addressed chuckled instead. "You are correct, young Khadgar," the mage replied. "I would find it difficult to speak to such shadowy figures myself." With a quick gesture, the elven prince dismissed his guise, standing revealed in his ornate violet golden robes, his long golden hair flowing past his shoulders, his sharp features alert with anticipation. "Is that better?" "Much, thank you," Khadgar said. He glanced around at the other council members. "And what of the rest of you? May I not see your face, Lord Crass? Lord Kel'Thuzad? Lord Antonidas? Lord Antonidas has not bothered with a disguise, and Prince Kael'thas has been considerate enough to dispense with his. Will the rest of you do the same?" Antonidas, seated before Khadgar on an invisible chair, laughed. "Indeed, youngling, indeed," he agreed. "This matter is far too serious for such parlor tricks, and you are no longer a whelp to be fooled and amazed by such slights. Unveil yourself, my friends, and let us be to this matter before the night grows older." The other magi obeyed, though a few grumbled, and seconds later Khadgar found himself facing 6 people clearly. He recognized Crassus at once, by his slight build, delicate features, and silvery hair still streaked here and there with red. And Kel'Thuzad was familiar as well, an impressive, charismatic man with dark hair and a full beard, and strangely glassy eyes, as if he were not really looking at the world around them. The other two, a pudgy man and a tall Sasquatch woman, Khadgar did not know know through their faces seemed vaguely familiar. Most likely he passed them in the halls in the Violet Citadel back when he had been a student here, and had simply not been important enough for them to address him directly. However, they were all at attention. "We have done as you asked," Kel'Thuzad complained. "Now tell us what has happened." "What do you want to know?" Khadgar asked the older mage. "Everything." And the look in his eye, and from the look in his eyes, Kel'Thuzad meant it. He'd always had a reputation as a dreamer and a researcher, constantly questing for information, particularly about magic, its sources, or its potential. Of all the Kirin Tor, he had been the one most interested in gaining access to Medivh's arcane library, and Khadgar assumed one of the most upset about its destruction. He had not bothered to mention that he had taken the choicest tomes for himself before vacating the tower. "Very well," and so he told them, gratefully accepting a chair the pudgy man offered. Khadgar sat and described everything that had happened since he had left Dalaran more than 2 years before. He told him about his strange apprenticeship with Medivh, about the Master's Wizard's merciful moods and strange disappearances. He told him about the first encounter with the Orcs. He told them about the Wizard's murder. He told them about Medivh's betrayal and how he and Lothar had ended the Wizard's life. Then went on to talk about the Horde and the battles that had occurred, about the siege of Stormwind, Lane's death, the city's conquest, and their subsequent flight. The Master Magi remained quiet for much of the reciting. Occasionally one would ask a question, but they showed surprised concern for someone so much their junior, and the few questions they did ask were short and to the point. When he had finally finished, ending with the Alliance and the Paladins, Khadgar leaned back to catch his breath and waited to see what the Magi did next. "You did not mention the Order of Tirisfal," Kel'Thuzad pointed out, electing a sharp cough from Antonidas. "What?" the mage researcher demanded. "Is it relevant to Medivh?" "What?" the mage researcher demanded. "It is relevant when discussing Medivh." "It is," Khadgar answered. "And I apologize for my lapse, but..." He glanced around, trying to judge the Magi's knowledge by their faces, and opted for discretion. "I know little of the Order's true workings. Medivh was a member and spoke once or twice of the Order's existence, but he did not name any other members or discuss its activities." "Of course," the woman agreed, and Khadgar saw the look of frustration and disappointment she and Kel'Thuzad exchanged. He had been right then, he realized. They knew nothing about the Order and had merely hoped to trick him in revealing its secrets. That had failed, and they would not press the issue. "But I am more concerned with Medivh himself and what happened to him," she continued. "You are certain it was Sargeras you saw within him?" "Absolutely." Khadgar leaned forward. "I'd already seen the Titan in a vision and recognized him at once." "So it was Medivh, or Sargeras through him, who opened the rift for the Orcs," the pudgy man mused. "And what did you say their world was called?" "Draenor," Khadgar answered, shuddering slightly. His mind flashed to another vision of Medivh's tower, that of him as an old man, or at least looking as he did now, leading a small force of warriors against a multitude of orcs, on a world with a blood-red sky. Garona had told him it sounded like Draenor, which meant he was destined to go there, and most likely not survive. He forced himself back to the conversation before him. "What do we know of it?" Crassus asked. "This world. You told us of the sky, but can you tell us of anything else?" I haven't been there myself, Kagar replied, thinking at least not yet. But a companion, a half-orc, told me a great deal of the world and about the orcs. He could see Garona in his mind's eye, and quickly turned away from that painful memory as well. The orcs were considerably more peaceful at home. They squabbled but didn't fight one another. The only real enemies were the ogres, and the orcs were far smaller and considerably more numerous. What happened? Kel'Thuzad asked. They were corrupted, Kagar explained. She didn't know all the details, the why and how of it, but gradually their skin changed from brown to green, and they began practicing different magics from what they had known before. They turned more savage, more violent. There was a great ceremony and a chalice of some sort. The chieftains drank from it, and the warriors, most of them anyways, the skin changed to a vivid green. Then, and their eyes turned red. They grew more powerful, stronger, and fiercer, and they all went blood crazy. They killed any foe they encountered, then began turning on each other. Plus their magics had leached the life from the soil, and their crops would not grow. They were on the verge of killing themselves, or of dying of starvation. But Medivh approached Gul'dan, the Horde's chief warlock, and offered him access to this world. Our world. Gul'dan accepted, and together they built the portal. They sent through a few clans at a time, and gradually increasing the number. Then, it was just a matter of waiting, building strength, scouting defenses, and finally attacking. And now we have them approaching us full force. Kel'Thas frowned. Yes. Kagar waited, but no one else spoke, and at last he stirred in his unseen chair. If there is nothing more, noble gentleman and lady, I will take my leave, he said. It's been a long and very tiring day. What are your plans now? The woman asked him as he rose from his chair. Kagar frowned. He had been pondering the same question since their arrival in Lordaeron. A part of him wanted to beg the Kirin Tor for protection. Perhaps he could resume his old job as an assistant to the librarian. He would not cause any trouble, and he would be safe behind the strongest magical defense in the world. Another part of him, however, hated the idea of hiding from the upcoming conflict. He had faced a demon, after all, and he survived. If he could handle that, surely he can handle an army of orcs. Besides, friendship and respect still counted for something, at least to him. I will stand with Lord Lothar, Kagar replied finally, deliberately keeping his voice casual. I have promised him my support, and he richly deserves it. After the war, assuming we survive, he shrugged. You are still a subject of Dalaran, the woman pointed out. If we called you back here and assigned you necessary work, would you obey the summons? Kagar thought about it for a few seconds. No, he answered slowly. I cannot return to that. After this war, if we survive, I'll return to my studies. Though whether I do that here or at Medivh's tower or some other location is entirely uncertain. The council members studied him, and he them. It was Crassus who finally broke the silence. You left here a mere boy, a fledgling apprentice, he said, and Kagar could hear the approval in his voice. But you have returned a master and a man. Kagar dipped his head in acknowledgement, to acknowledge the compliment, but he did not say anything. You will not be ordered to do anything, Antonidas assured him. We shall respect your wishes and your independence, though we would like to be kept up to date, particularly for anything involving Medivh, the necromancers, the Order, and that portal. Kagar nodded. Then I'm free to go. That earned him a tight smile from Antonidas. Yes, you may go, the Archmage said. May the light protect you and grant you strength. Keep us informed, the the pudgy man said. The sooner we know the Orcs' plan, the sooner we can send troops to that area, and of course we can provide magical assistance as well. Kaggar nodded. Of course. He left the room quickly, but as soon as the doors had shut, he summoned a scrying sphere. The Kirin Tor met in a quiet room they assumed had been magically shielded not only from attacks, but also from prying eyes. But Kaggar had learned a great deal from Medivh during his short apprenticeship, and had learned more from the books he had appropriated after the Master Mage's defeat. He was also very close to his target subject. He concentrated, and the colors within the sphere swirled from green to black and back again. Faces began to appear in the image, and a faint murmuring, and then he was looking at the Kirin Tor council members in plain violet robes. Even the room's active mural had changed, slowing down and finally coming to a stop, leaving only a plain chamber with 6 people milling about him. I don't know how far we can trust him, the pudgy man was saying. He did not seem very eager to accede to our wishes. Of course not, Kael'thas replied shortly. I doubt you would be any more open and trusting if you had been through as much as he had. We do not need to trust him, regardless. We only need him to provide us with an introduction to Lothar, and to mediate between us and any others. I'm sure we can trust him not to undermine our efforts, not to turn against us, and not to withhold any evidence and information we might need. I do not see where we would want or need any more than that. This other world, Draenor, that troubles me, Crassus murmured. If the Orcs could pass through that portal, so could others from either side. We know they had ogres there, but have no idea what else to expect. That means they could have even worse creatures waiting eagerly for their chance to enter and then devastate this world. Also, there is nothing to stop the Orcs from retreating to their home whenever they feel it necessary. Fighting an enemy with an impregnable home base becomes considerably more difficult, as he can pop out, attack, and then disappear again. We should make finding and destroying that portal our first priority. Agreed, said Kael'thas. Destroy the portal. The others nodded. Good. That's settled. What else? They began to talk about something more mundane, schedules for cleaning the Violet Citadel's laboratories, and Kaggar let the scrying sphere fade away, image and all. That had gone better than he expected. Kael'thas was right. He had gone through a great deal in the past 3 years, and he had half expected the Kirin Tor to grow furious with his lack of respect. But they had not said anything at all, and seemed to believe his story without any prompting, which certainly made for a pleasant change. Now he just needed to teleport himself back to the capital city and sleep, so that he would be awake enough to be of any use tomorrow. A week later, Lothar stood in a command tent in southern Lordaeron, not far from South Shore, where he and Kaggar had first arrived. They had chosen this area because it was central enough to reach any part of the continent quickly, particularly by boat. Outside, his troops marshaled and drilled and slept. Inside, he and the Lordaeron kings and the 4 men he had chosen for lieutenants clustered around the table and stared at the map laid across it. Lothar had made Uthar his liaison to the Silver Hand and to the Church. The paladins had made surprising progress in their fighting skills and in wielding the light. Kaggar was both his contact with the Magi and his most objective advisor. Proudmoore controlled the navy, of course. It hadn't even been a question. But young Turalian, Lothar had made his second in command. The youth had impressed both him and Kaggar, and had shown himself to be smart, focused, and loyal, and hard-working, even if he did still treat Lothar as if he were some legendary figure. Lothar was sure the lad would grow out of that, however, and could not think of anyone better qualified to serve as his right hand. Turalyon was clearly still nervous about such a heavy responsibility, and Lothar had twice been forced to remind him not to jab absently at the map. At least not with a knife. They were discussing the same things they had been discussing for a week now. Which way the Horde would most likely go, where they might attack, and how to bring the Alliance troop there as quickly as possible, at least without trampling the very fields and crops they had united to protect. Just as Greymane was insisting for the 10th time that the Alliance forces be stationed all around Gneis' border in case the Orcs somehow appeared there first, a scout burst in. "Sir, you have to see this, sir," he shouted, trying to stop his forward momentum. Bow and slew all at the same time. "They are here." "Who is here, soldier?" Lothar frowned. He was trying to read the scout's expression and having a hard time of it. The man was so flustered. He didn't look terrified, however, which meant Lothar could take a deep breath and try to get his own racing heart back under control. Because no terror meant it wasn't the Horde. There was fear on the scout's face. It was mixed with respect, even awe. Lothar had never seen anything quite like it. "The elves, sir!" The scout all but shouted. "The elves are here!" "The elves?" Lothar stated at the scout, trying to process the fact, then turned and glanced at the assembled kings. He had suspected one of them coughed and looked slightly guilty. "We need allies," King Ternus explained, "and the elves are a mighty race. I thought it best to contact them immediately." "Without consulting me?" Lothar was furious. "And what if they had sent an entire army and suddenly announced they were in control? What if the Horde arrives while you're working to assimilate them into our own forces? You do not conceal details like this from your military commander. It could mean our deaths, or at the very least the deaths of many of our people." Ternus nodded soberly. "You're correct, of course," he answered, reminding Lothar once again why he liked the king. Most men were unwilling to accept fault, and often those with authority even worse about it. But Ternus took full responsibility for his actions, good or bad. "I should have consulted you first. First, I felt time was of the essence, and that is no excuse. It would not happen again." Lothar nodded. "Fine. Let us go and see what these elves look like, then." He marched out of the tent, and the others followed close behind him. The first thing Lothar saw as he peeled back the tent flap and stepped outside were his own troops. Their army filled the valley and beyond, stretching across the landscape, and for an instant Lothar felt a rush of pride and confidence. How could anything stand against so mighty a force? But then he saw again in his mind's eye the Horde washing over Stormwind, an unstoppable emerald sea, and grew sober again. Still, the Alliance army was many times larger than Stormwind's had been. They would at least give the Horde a serious pause. Glancing past his troops, Lothar's gaze came to the shore and the sea beyond. Proudmoore's ships were anchored all along the coastline, from the small fast scout ships to the massive destroyers, creating a force of mass and sails across the waves. But many of them had pulled back from the docks, creating an open channel and sailing up that space were clustered ships such Lothar had never seen before. "Elven destroyers," Proudmoore whispered at his elbow. "Faster than our own and lighter. They carry less weaponry, but make that up for speed. An excellent addition to our forces." The naval admiral frowned. "So few." "I only count 4. And 8 smaller vessels. This is a single battle group." "Perhaps more will follow, then," Turalyon suggested from Lothar's other side. But Proudmoore shook his head. That would not be their way," he answered. "They would arrive all together." "A dozen ships is still a dozen more than we had before," Kagger pointed out, "and whatever troops they carry as well." Lothar nodded. "Would you go and greet them?" he said, and the others all agreed. Together they set out across the valley. Perinold and Greymane were not used to such exertions and were gasping in minutes, but the rest were fit, and they moved briskly, reaching the docks just as the first ship glided to stop beside it. A tall, lithe figure leaped across, landing lightly on the rough wooden pier. Long golden hair caught the sunlight, and Lothar heard at least one of his comrades gasp behind him. As the figure drew closer, Lothar saw it was a woman, and a stunning one at that. Her slender features were delicate but strong, as was her lean, willowy body. She wore forest green and oak brown, a strange lightweight breastplate over her shirt and breeches, and a long cloak with a hood tossed back, and leather gloves covered her arms to the elbow, just as boots protected her legs to the knee. A slim sword hung at one hip, a pouch and a horn at the other, and across her back were slung a longbow and a quiver of arrows. Lothar had seen many women over the years, some of them as beautiful as this elf approaching them, but he had never seen one who so easily combined strength and grace. He could understand why several of his comrades already seemed smitten. "Milady," Lothar called out when she was still a few paces away. "Welcome. I am Anduin Lothar, commander of the Alliance of Lordaeron." She nodded, covering the remaining distance and stopping only a hand-span away. From here, he could see the pointed ears poking through her hair and the wide emerald-green eyes that slanted up at the corners. "I am Illyria Windrunner, and I bring you greetings from Alistair and Sunstrider and the Council of Silvermoon." Her voice was lovely, musical, and rich, and Lothar suspected it was pleasant even in anger. "Thank you." He turned and gestured to the men gathered around him. "Allow me to present the kings of the Alliance, as well as my lieutenants." After introductions had been made, he turned to more serious matters. "Forgive my bluntness, Lady Illyria," he said, drawing a smile from her at the title, "but I must ask, is this all the aid your people can muster?" That brought a frown from her. "I'll tell you straight, Lord Lothar," he replied, glancing around to make sure no others were listening. Several other elves, both men and women, had left the ship, and now were clustered at the far end of the pier, clearly awaiting Illyria's permission to move closer. "And Asterin and the others were little concerned at the reports you sent. This horde is far distant from us and seems intent on conquering human lands and not our own forests. The council members feel it is better to leave this conflict to the younger races, and merely strengthen our own borders to prevent any additional incursions." Her eyes narrowed, showing what she thought of such discussions. "Yet you are here," Kagger pointed out. "Surely that means something." She nodded. "The missive from King Ternus," she nodded in his direction, "informed us that you, Lord Lothar, were the last of the Arathi bloodline. Our ancestors pledged eternal support to your King Thoradin and all his kin. An Asterion could not deny that obligation. He has sent this battle group to acknowledge the debt." "And you?" Lothar asked, noting she had only mentioned the ships. "I am here of my own accord," she announced, proudly, tossing her head back in the same way he had seen spirited stallions do when they challenged. "I am a ranger, and choose to bring my own detachment and offer our aid freely." She glanced beyond Lothar, her eyes roaming, and he knew she was studying the army spread out behind him. "I sensed the conflict was far more serious than my own rulers realized. Such a war could easily spread to all of us, and if the Horde is as victorious as you say, our forest will not remain unviolated for long." She turned back to meet Lothar's gaze, and he could see that for all her beauty, this was a strong woman used to battle. "We must stop them." Lothar nodded. "I agree." He bowed. "Well, you are welcome here, my lady, and I thank your lords for their token support." but I am far more grateful for your presence and that of your rangers. He smiled. We were just discussing our next move, and I would be pleased to hear your opinion, and once your people are settled, I will ask you to send them scouting, that we may be sure the enemy is not upon us yet. We need no rest, Allura assured him. I will send them at once. She gestured, and the other elves approached. Each was garbed as she was, and moved as quietly, though to Lothar's eyes they lacked their singular grace. Lyra spoke with them, her words fluid and musical and completely foreign to Lothar, and the others. And the others nodded as they and the others nodded and then flitted past them with a brief nod, disappearing at a run off the docks and through the valley. Within minutes they had vanished from sight. They will scout and report back, Allura explained. If the horde has come within 2 days' march of here, we will know of it. Excellent. Lothar ran his hand absently over his bare forehead. If you would care to accompany us back to the command tent, then, milady, I will show you what we know thus far, and we will hear your thoughts in the matter. She laughed. Of course. But you will have to stop calling me milady if you want me to pay proper attention. It is Allura, and nothing more. Lothar nodded in turn, leading her off the docks. As he did, he caught the glimpse of Turalian's face and suppressed a grin. Now he knew where the gasp had come from. Two days later, Lothar found he had nothing to smile about. Allura's scouts had returned, as had Proudmoore's, and both had the same news to share. The horde had taken Kazmodan, and used the dwarves' mines to craft ships of their own. Massive, ungainly vessels of iron and timber. Fuck's like Pippin. Iron and timber that moved awkwardly, but could carry thousands of orcs into their deep holds. These ships had carried the horde swiftly across the water, and they had indeed aimed at the southern coast of Lordaeron, not far from Granrain's domain. However, it looked as if the horde would come ashore in the Hillsbrad region, halfway between here and Gilneas. If the alliance moved quickly, they could be there waiting when the horde arrived. Gather the troops, Lothar bellowed. Leave everything not essential. We can send people back for it later if we survive. Right now, we need speed more than anything else. Go! Go! He turned to Gagar as his other lieutenants ran from the command tent to muster their own troops, the king's right beside them. And so it begins. He told the young old wizard. Kagar nodded. It's not we would have more time, he admitted. So did I, Lothar agreed. While these orcs are impatient to conquer, that may be their downfall. He sighed. At least I hope so. He stared at the maps of Hillsbrad for a moment, trying to envision the coming battle, then shook his head. There were things to do, many of them, and battle would come soon enough. Are we ready? Chapter 8. Are we ready? Turalian gulped and nodded. Ready, sir? Lothar nodded and turned away, frowning, and for a second Turalian worried the expression was because of him. Had he given the wrong response? Had Lord Lothar wanted more detail? Was there something else he was supposed to say or do? Stop it, he warned himself. You're panicking. Again! Calm down. You're doing fine. He's frowning because we're about to go into battle, not because you've disappointed him. Forcing himself not to think about it anymore, Turalian gave his gear one more inspection. The straps of armor were all good and tight. His shield was steady on his arm. His warhammer was slung from its straddle horn. He was ready as he could be. Looking around, he studied the other figures nearby. Lothar was talking to Uther, and Turalian envisioned both men their pose. They looked slightly impatient, but otherwise completely calm. Was that just something you picked up as you got more experience? Khadgar was looking out over the plain, and must have sensed Tyrellian's gaze, because he turned and gave him a weary smile. Nervous? The mage asked. Tyrellian grinned, despite himself. Very, he admitted. He had been raised with the typical sense of respect but wariness towards the Magi. But Khadgar was different. Perhaps it was because they were near the same age, though the mage looked decades older. Or perhaps it was simply that Khadgar didn't hold himself above non-Magi the way Tyrellian and the other seen wizards do. They had struck up an easy conversation that first day after Archbishop Fallon introduced all of them, and Tyrellian had found himself liking Khadgar. He liked Lothar as well, but was in awe of the champion's experience and martial skills. Khadgar was probably more powerful personally, but somehow he was more approachable, and he and Tyrellian had become fast friends. He was the only one Tyrellian felt safe telling about his fears. Don't worry about it, Khadgar advised. Everyone is. The trick is just to work past it. You're nervous too. The Magi grinned. Scared spineless. Scared spitless would be closer, it revealed. I've been every time we've been in combat. It was Lothar who told me, after one encounter, that you should be scared. Because the man who isn't afraid gets careless, and that's when he gets hurt. Tyrellian nodded. My instructor said much the same thing. He shook his head. It's one thing to say that, though, and another to believe it. His friend patted him on the shoulder. You'll do fine, I'm sure, he assured him. Once it starts, you'll be too busy to think about it. They both turned and looked out again. The Hillsbrad region was so named for its rolling foothills, and the Alliance army was spread across the last line of those hills, facing Lordaeron's south shore, and the Great Sea beyond. The Horde ships were approaching, even as they watched. Massive, unwieldy vessels of dark metal and blackened wood, without sails, but with rows upon rows of oars. Lothar intended to meet the Horde as it emerged from the water, before the Orcs had a chance to find the footing. Proudmoore's navy had already assaulted the ships during their passage, destroying several vessels and sending thousands of Orcs to the bottom of the ocean. But the Horde was so numerous they had merely picked off the outermost ships while the rest sailed past. They would still be fighting aplenty when they landed. They are almost here, sure, Alira reported. Her sharp elven eyes seen further than theirs. She turned towards Tyrellian. Best ready your men for attack. Tyrellian nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had seen women before, of course, and nothing about his order forbade relationships or even marriage. But the Elven Ranger had made every other woman he had ever met seem both weak and rough at the same time. She was so confident, so graceful, and so lovely, his mouth ran dry every time he saw her, and he often found himself trembling and sweating like a horse that had just ran a hard race. And judging by the glint in her eyes, and the half-smile when she said anything to him, Tyrellian suspected she knew and enjoyed his discomfort. Now, at least, he had something to distract him. Signaling his unit leaders, Tyrellian gave them the go-ahead gesture. They, in turn, gave orders to their heralds, who sounded the advance on their battle horns. Within minutes, the entire Alliance force was in motion, marching and riding slowly but steadily down the hill and towards the shore. As they closed the distance, Tyrellian made out more detail. He saw the first of the ships breach itself, and a dark figure swarm over its side, stomping up the rocky beach and toward the foothills. Even from here, he could see they were broadly built, with thick chests and long, powerful arms, and bandy legs that ate up the distance. They brandished weapons, axes and hammers and swords and spears, and there were a lot of them. "They have reached the land!" Lothar shouted, drawing his massive greatsword with a single sweep and holding it aloft, the gold runes along its blade catching the light. "Charge! For Lordaeron!" He spurred his horse, and it leapt forward past the Alliance ranks, the golden lion on his shield catching the light. Damn. Turalyon kicked his own steed into gallop and took off after his commander, snatching up his hammer and dropping his helm into place as he moved. He saw soldiers scrambling out of the way, and others hastened to catch up, and then he was past them, and in the narrow stretch between the two armies. But soon enough that vanished, and he crashed full force into the orcs, reaching them just as Lothar's first swing took down several, and others advanced towards his horse, determined to pull the champion down and tear him apart. No! Turalyon swung as soon as he was within reach, his hammer catching the orc full in the head. The creature dropped with barely a sound, and Turalyon knocked a second one aside with his shield, battering the orc away long enough to bring his hammer back around and smash that one as well. By the light, they were ugly. Lothar and Khadgar had described them, but it was not the same as seeing them firsthand, with that vivid green skin, those glowing red eyes, and those tusks. He had seen such things on boars before, but never anything that walked on two legs and carried a weapon. They were strong, too. He saw an orc's warhammer clash with his own and almost drove his weapon back into his helm. The creature struck with such force. Fortunately, they seemed to rely more on strength and aggression than skill. He was able to twist his weapon free and bring it back around, its half catching the orc a glancing blow across the chest and stunning it long enough for Turalyon to strike again properly. Lothar cleared the orcs from his side with a vicious sword swing, and Turalyon guided his horse beside the commander so they stood side by side, hammer and greatsword in constant motion. Uther was right behind them now, his own mighty hammer crushing the orcs left and right, a visible glow surrounding him and his weapon, and making the orcs turn away, shielding their eyes. A cheer arose from the Alliance forces as they saw the paladin's prowess. Turalyon was not surprised. He had trained alongside Uther and knew the older paladin's faith was incredibly strong enough to manifest visibly. He wished his hone was solid. Now was not the time to think of that, however. More orcs' warships reaching the beach, and orcs were pouring from them by the thousands. Turalyon saw at once they would be overwhelmed if they stayed. "Sir," he shouted to Lothar, "we need to move back to the rest of the army." At first, he thought the champion had not heard him, but Lothar skewered another orc and then nodded. "Uther!" he shouted, and the paladin turned. "Back to the others!" Uther raised his hammer in salute and wheeled his horse around at once, bludgeoning a path back through the gathering horde. Lothar was right behind him, and Turalyon brought up the rear, laying about him with hammer and shield to keep orc hands and weapons at bay. One orc reached for him, a massive axe ready in his other hand, only to fall with an arrow through its throat. Turalyon risked a quick glance around and saw a slender figure back of the hill raise the longbow and salute. He could just make out the gleam of her hair from here. Several times he thought they would fall, but he, Uther, and Lothar made it back to the front line safely. The horde was right behind them. "Form up!" Lothar shouted. "Rise spears! Link shields! Repel them!" The soldiers hurried to obey. They had been standing ready but separately, individuals rather than a unified force. But that would not work against the horde's superior numbers. Now they moved together, forming a solid shield wall that bristled with spears, and the horde crashed into that. The several places the wall fell, a defender overpowered by an orc's charge, but much of it held as the orc fell back, clutching new wounds. Some dropped and did not rise again, though their followers quickly swarmed over and past them. A second wave struck the shield wall, collapsing more sections, but again the orcs took heavy casualties. Turalyon signaled the nearest unit leader and was pleased to see them respond quickly. A second shield wall was already forming behind the first. They could build wall after wall, and if each one cost the orcs heavily, they could whistle away the horde until it was small enough to face the creatures directly. But the orcs, clearly not stupid, after the third collision they held back as if waiting for something. And Turalyon soon saw what. A handful of heavy cloaked figures advanced. Each wore a cowl low over its face, so only the eyes were visible deep within, and each carried a strange glowing truncheon. These creatures rode strange, heavy barred horses with glowing eyes, and charged forward directly towards the shield wall, and raised their truncheons as they approached. Turalyon felt as much as heard the strange buzzing, and the soldiers directly in front of the creatures collapsed, clutching their heads as blood poured from their mouths, nose, and ears. "By the light!" Uther was standing near Tyrolian and bristled at the sight. The fiends! They wield dark magic against us. He raised his hammer high, and its head glowed silver like the moon. Stand fast, soldiers, he shouted. The holy light protects you. The glow spread from his hammer, shining down upon the warriors and bathing them in its light. When it cloaked the figures raised their hands again, the soldiers winced, but did not fall. Then Uther came crashing down upon them. The shield wall opened long enough to allow him and the other paladins, including Gavinrad, who Fal had happily introduced into the order, through. Again, alliance soldiers cheered, heartened by the paladin's surprising skill and power. Tyrolian felt torn. As a paladin, his place was beside them, but as Luther's lieutenant, his place was here, overseeing the men. The paladin and the cloaked figures were battling now, neither able to gain the upper hand. Tyrolian saw one of the strange invaders clap its hand on Gavinrad's arm, darkness radiating from the grip. But Gavinrad's holy aura shone brighter and drove the darkness away, causing his attacker to shrink back and duck a blow from the paladin's hammer. Meanwhile, the orcs continued to batter at the shield wall, tearing holes in the fence, only to have another soldier step up and fill the gap. Then, a movement caught Tyrolian's eye, and he saw several new figures approaching, towering above the orcs. Ogres. The massive creatures advanced, swinging rough clubs that were little more than uprooted trees, and the whole section of shield wall collapsed, soldiers crushed by powerful blows. The horde poured forward through the gaps, sweeping among the alliance soldiers. Change tactics! Tyrolian shouted at the nearest herald, knowing the men would relay the orders with his small horn. Small shield units, pull back to the hills and regroup. The soldiers nodded and raised his horn, blowing a short blast and another. At the sound, the unit leaders began shouting orders of their own, gathering the soldiers and retreating while keeping the orcs at bay. The horde tried overrunning them, but the alliance soldiers were clumped too close together and kept their weapons up, jabbing at any orc to come too close. Each unit had its shield linked as well, forming a small shield wall all around. The orcs overwhelmed several units by sheer number, crashing into the warriors again and again until they faltered, but most of the alliance soldiers were able to pull back successfully. Tyrolian rode along the ranks at the base of the hill, organizing them. He set up another shield wall there, and as each unit retreated to it, the wall opened to allow them in and then closed behind them. These soldiers then reinforced the wall themselves and helped bring other units through safely. Tyrolian asked the archers to keep the orcs away from the wall as much as possible, harassing any creature that came too close to pulling down a defender. They were taking a heavy toll upon the orcs, but the horde was still breaching ships and adding more to the battle with every minute. We cannot hold it for long, Tyrolian shouted to Khadgar, who had just done something to make a strange orc collapse near a boat. The orc had been dressed in robes rather than armor, and he carried a staff instead of a sword. So Tyrolian guessed it was a warlock, their equivalent to a mage. We need to do something to keep them from reaching the hills. If they get past us, they'll advance straight north to the capital city. Khadgar nodded. I'll do what I can, he promised the young. The young old wizard concentrated, and the sky above them darkened. Within minutes, it went from a clear day to an ominous black clouds. The sudden storm centered upon Khadgar, with Mage's white hair dancing about him. Lightning flickered in the sky, and an answering spark danced across his outstretched fingers. Then, there was a shattering boom. A lightning bolt leaped forward, not from the sky, but from Khadgar's hands. Its light split in the darkness and struck shy of the shield wall and a cluster of orcs, and they went flying, burst into a crisp by the powerful bolts. A second one struck, and a third, and Tyrolian used the magical attack to his advantage. He regrouped his men, shoring up the shield wall, and also sent soldiers forward with brush and tinder. They laid fires in the orcs' path, creating a raging blaze that stopped the horde from advancing to the west. That reduced the risk of their surrounding the alliance forces and made it easier to contain and block. Nor were the orcs slow to notice. Several of the creatures stepped forward trying to put out the fire, but Elwyn Archer shot them down before they could reach the flames. One fell into the fire instead and screamed as it consumed him. That made the others shrink back again. The ogres were the problem, however. One lumbered through the flames, burning its legs, but otherwise not slowing down. Turalian directed a full unit against it and targeted it with ballista as well, but the ogre downed many warriors before it finally fell. The others were approaching behind him. "Target them!" Turalian told Khadgar. "Take out the ogres!" Khadgar glanced his way, and Turalian saw that his friend looked truly exhausted. "I will try," the mage agreed. "But drawing forth the lightning is taxing." An instant later, a lightning bolt burst from his fingers and struck the lead ogre, killing it at once. But even as this massive blackened corpse fell, Khadgar shook his head. "That is all I can do," he warned. Turalian hoped it would be enough. The other ogres hesitated, even their smaller brains able to comprehend the danger, and that gave his men time to target them with arrows and more ballista. The shield wall still held, but the horde was massing again, and before long it would be able to simply roll over the defenders, its losses barely diminishing its bulk. Uther and the other paladins had not returned, and Turalian could only assume they were still battling those cloaked figures at bay. He was still wondering what to do when Lothar's apprentice beside him. "Ready the cavalry!" the champion shouted, "and sound the charge!" "Charge? Into that?" Turalian stared at his commander for an instant, then shrugged. "Well, why not?" Their defenses could not hold out forever. He signaled the herald, who blew a mighty blast. Then those warriors on horseback were forming up, and Turalian swung in with them, placing himself just behind Lothar, who rode at their head. The shield wall parted for them, and they crashed into the horde's front ranks, carving a path through the orcs. After a minute, Lothar signaled, and they wheeled about, the archers providing cover as they swung clear, then struck again. They were readying for a third charge when a drum beat from somewhere within the horde, and the orcs fell back. "We did it!" Turalian shouted. "They're retreating!" Lothar nodded, but did not turn away, watching as the orcs turned and ran a short distance, then regrouped. Then the creatures turned and began to move in again, at the fast march, to the right of the Alliance forces. "They're heading east," Lothar said quietly. He made no move to chase them. "Into the hinterlands." "We're going after them?" Turalian asked. His blood was still racing from the charge, and he wanted to run after the orcs to smash them all. "We have them on the run." Well, the champion shook his head. "No. They are cornered. We blocked them and held. But they are not running away from us. They are going around us. Now," he did turn to Turalian and smiled with a grim, weary smile. "Still," he said, "that is something." But should we go after them before they can find another place to stand?" Turalian urged. "Shouldn't we—" "We should," Lothar agreed. "But look behind you." Turalian turned and saw at once what the older warrior meant. Their forces were sagging now. The battle was over, and he saw the men collapsing where they stood, both from wounds and from sheer fatigue. The battle had lasted for hours, though it had not felt like it at the time, and he found himself aching as well now that it was done. Plus, they had destroyed many weapons, emptied most of their ballista, and used up most of the army's firewood and tinder as well. "We need to resupply," Turalian admitted out loud. "We are in no shape to pursue them now." "No." Lothar turned his horse back towards their own lines. "But we have tested their forces now, and our men have seen that they can stand against the horde. That is good. And we have kept them from the capital. Also good." He glanced at Turalian and nodded finally. "You did well," he said quietly before nudging his horse back toward the troops and the command tent beyond. Turalian watched him go for a moment. The simple praise had filled him with pride, and he realized, as he brought his own horse around to follow his commander, Khadgar had been right. He had no time to be afraid.